Han Eun-seong planned to spend the evening and night with his lover, until an unexpected phone call interrupted. Ju Hyun asked the protagonist to attend an event, fully aware of his disdain for crowded places. Initially, he asked the young man to come without any compensation, but later the deal evolved into a bottle of wine as payment for the favor. While his lover was in the shower, Han Eun-seong quickly dressed and tidied himself up. He informed the man that he was leaving, only to receive a wave of disapproval and judgment in return. The protagonist didn't bother to justify himself. Instead, he turned back with a laugh and remarked that he had traded their intimacy for a bottle of wine. By this time, the event was already in full swing. Most of the guests had gathered and were engaging in lively conversation. Upon arrival, Han Eun-seong immediately felt out of place. Suddenly, a familiar woman, noticeably older, called out to him. A casual conversation ensued between them, touching on publications and the ceremony that had attracted so many attendees. In the end, the woman advised him to mingle with the crowd and perhaps meet someone, as such events were designed for that purpose. However, Han Eun-seong had little interest in associating with what he considered shallow people. Time passed. Alcohol filled glasses to the brim, and the attendees grew increasingly intoxicated. Everyone seemed to have a question for the protagonist, and while he responded politely, there was a limit to his patience. Unable to endure the social pressure any longer, the man decided to step outside for some fresh air. Intrusive thoughts filled his mind. He couldn't comprehend why he had even bothered to attend this event. On the bright side, at least it was organized in honor of a book's publication. Had it been a concert, he would have had to endure twice as much. On the balcony, he sat down on the cold floor to catch his breath. Suddenly, his phone rang, displaying his mother's contact on the screen. Han Eun-seong decided that now was not the time for such conversations and declined the call. A few minutes later, the sound of a piano echoed from the hall, signaling the start of the official part of the event. At first, the protagonist enjoyed the melody, but then he began to notice wrong notes or blatant falsehoods in the performance. Nonetheless, it wasn't that important. He just felt the performer was taking too many liberties. After spending some more time on the balcony, Han Eun-seong decided it was time to return. He was feeling better and thought it would be best to leave the event unnoticed. But fate had other plans. Just as he was about to enter the room, a stranger stopped him, grabbing his wrist. The protagonist visibly tensed, trying to free his hand from the stranger's grip while insisting he didn't know who this man was. The stranger grew furious, recalling all too well how Han Eun-seong had insulted his performance earlier that year. Several people, including Gyubin, were observing the altercation from a distance. It seemed a fight was imminent between the two men. One drunk, the other suddenly recalling who stood before him. With a swift maneuver, Han Eun-seong mockingly threw a few sharp words at the stranger. Infuriated, the man lunged at him with clenched fists. Fortunately, the blow was avoided as Gyubin unexpectedly intervened, physically pushing the combatants apart. Only a moment later did Han Eun-seong realize that Gyubin had taken the punch intended for him. The impact was so strong that the young man's lip was split and his cheek bruised. Hearing the commotion, people started to rush around. Meanwhile, the attacker, in his stupor, tried to comprehend who had just thwarted him. Gyubin's first concern wasn't for himself but for Han Eun-seong, asking if the man was all right. Han Eun-seong, bewildered by the situation, couldn't understand why, or more importantly, for what reason this young man had just saved him. Just in time, security arrived. Whether someone had called them or they came on their own due to the noise was unclear. Regaining his composure, the protagonist stood up and somewhat curtly thanked Gyubin for his intervention, though he believed it unnecessary. Gyubin didn't respond, merely watching the man in silence, pressing a hand to his throbbing cheek. The next day, upon arriving at the academy, Han Eun-seong noticed his wrist had swollen considerably. Deciding to tend to it later, he headed to the director's office, encountering two little girls on his way. The man asked them where the director was, but they failed to give a coherent answer. This was precisely why Han Eun-seong disliked children, and how relieved he was when they ran off. Upon entering the office, the first thing the protagonist noticed was Gyubin, the young man who had saved him the previous day, along with his younger brother. After an awkward glance between them, the man greeted Gyubin, only then noticing the bandage on his cheek. Sending the children off to play outside the office, the two men were left alone in silence. Gyubin awkwardly lowered his gaze to the desk, while Han Eun-seong nervously drummed his fingers on it. Seeking to break the tension, Gyubin was the first to speak, asking if the man before him was truly the famous Han Eun-seong. Upon receiving a terse confirmation, Gyubin let out a breath, reminding him that he hadn't answered his question yesterday. Han Yun-sung, slightly embarrassed, adjusted his bangs, only to be startled when Gyubin unexpectedly grabbed his hand. The brunette expressed his delight at meeting such a renowned person, albeit in a rather peculiar way. The protagonist, initially disbelieving what he heard, pulled back, but then leaned in again just to make sure he hadn't misheard. Finally releasing his grip, Gyubin admitted that he had been a bit too nervous. The man didn't hold it against him. On the contrary, he found the young man to be quite naive and utterly harmless, which made him almost want to tease him. Resting his head on his hand, Han Eun-seong remarked that he didn't care how Gyubin knew about him since the details of his life were hardly a secret. The only question that mattered to him was why Gyubin had been so eager to meet him. Gyubin visibly blushed, stumbling over his words, at first offering the excuse of fame, but then revealing the real reason: his articles. He mumbled something about an April issue and then added that Han Eun-seong looked far more attractive in person than in photos. Such bluntness amused the protagonist, and an awkward silence once again filled the office. Unexpectedly, Gyubin brought up dinner and seemed on the verge of inviting the celebrity to join him. But Han Eun-seong politely declined, explaining that he doesn't dine with someone right after their first meeting. Gyubin seemed disappointed by the refusal, but then the man asked him if the article was truly the only reason for wanting to meet him. Deciding to be direct, Gyubin asked if he still played the piano. Han Eun-seong's expression changed instantly. His smile vanished, the sparkle in his eyes faded, leaving only a look of disappointment. Gyubin, seemingly oblivious, continued talking, mentioning his desire to take a few private lessons. Suddenly, the protagonist clutched his head and burst into a manic laughter, making Gyubin visibly uneasy. Finding the situation rather amusing, Han Eun-seong handed Gyubin his business card, saying he was curious to see how the lessons would go. Gyubin's face lit up with joy as he eagerly anticipated their first lesson. Not having met with the director, the protagonist returned home, mentally piecing together why the consultation never took place. Regardless, there was one positive outcome from his visit. He had met an interesting person. After changing, the man sat down at his computer, deciding to check his emails. Among the new messages, there was an invitation to a wedding. Han Eun-seong didn't bother reading it in full. The moment he saw familiar names, he immediately clicked delete, deciding not to dwell on it. The protagonist treated himself to a relaxing evening in the bath with a glass of wine in hand. Yet memories seemed to deliberately flood his thoughts. Of his mother, who did nothing but scold him for playing the piano poorly. Little Han Eun-seong couldn't understand why he was treated this way, why voices were raised. It was all a terrible burden for a child. A burden that, in adulthood, manifested into something far worse, so much so that his hands trembled, causing the glass to shatter. Startled, Han Eun-seong sat up abruptly, trying to steady his breathing, when suddenly the recent question about whether he still played the piano resurfaced in his mind. All of this combined brought the protagonist to tears, shattering not only the glass but also any hope for a peaceful evening. The next day, as agreed, Gyubin arrived for his private lesson with Han Eun-seong. The host greeted his student, asking if he'd like something to drink. Gyubin didn't refuse the offer of coffee, and after a brief conversation in the kitchen, they moved to the piano. As any good teacher would, Han Eun-seong began by asking the brunette why he wanted to learn to play the instrument. It turned out that Gyubin writes music-related articles for social media. The man initially thought this was Gyubin's main profession, but as usual, the young man began to stammer. So, Han Eun-seong asked him to stop speaking in riddles, and Gyubin finally confessed that he wasn't a professional writer, just an amateur. Deciding not to press further, the man lifted the piano lid and instructed Gyubin to sit down. The teacher explained that he needed to see how Gyubin played in order to assess his skill level and determine where to begin. Gyubin didn't argue, but it was clear to the naked eye how nervous he was. As his fingers hovered over the keys, Gyubin hesitated, unsure of what to do, and remained frozen in place. With a sigh, Han Eun-seong realized that Gyubin knew nothing, so he asked if the young man had any knowledge of piano playing at all. The brunette, with an awkward grin, admitted that his knowledge was limited to the music lessons he had in school. The protagonist then decided to start from the very beginning. Gently pushing Gyubin aside, he pointed to the keys and explained which notes corresponded to which keys. The proximity made Gyubin feel uneasy, so much so that beads of sweat began to form on his skin. Meanwhile, Han Eun-seong acted like a true professional, with no hint of anything but instruction in his words. He gently took Gyubin's hand in his, evaluating how he held his wrist. He offered some tips on how to better control it, then praised Gyubin for his attentiveness, though Gyubin's thoughts were entirely consumed by how pleasant Han Yun-sung's voice sounded. After some time, it turned out that Gyubin could read sheet music, meaning he had at least some basic knowledge. The man decided to test this, suggesting that Gyubin play one of the simpler compositions. Gyubin glanced at the sheet music, feeling lost, and hesitantly asked if the teacher could play it first as an example. Han Eun-sung found this odd, as the piece was simple enough for a child to play, but Gyubin insisted. This forced the man to admit that he no longer played the piano, and that it had been a long time since he had last sat at the instrument. Instead of a demonstration, Han Eun-sung suggested watching a video tutorial, but Gyubin objected, saying that doing so would defeat the purpose of a private lesson. Gyubin wanted Han Eun-sung to be his teacher, which was why he had specifically asked for private lessons. Standing up abruptly, Gyubin demanded a clear answer. Why had Han Yun-sung agreed to teach him if he had no intention of doing so? The protagonist was fortunate to avoid answering, as the kettle's whistle suddenly signaled that the water had boiled. Left alone with their thoughts for a moment, both men reflected on what had just transpired. After brewing the coffee, Han Yun-sung brought Gyubin his cup, and the young man began to apologize for his outburst. But the man cut him off, saying it was all right. He also mentioned that he understood why Gyubin wanted him to teach piano, but even so, he asked him not to bring up the idea of him playing again. With that, the serious conversation ended and the real lesson began, lasting until evening. Before leaving, Gyubin thanked the man for the lesson, and Han Yun-sung suggested they continue at the academy since the student didn't have a piano to practice on. Gyubin hesitated, causing Han Yun-sung to laugh, before finally bidding him farewell and closing the door. At that moment, the phone rang, and the man had to answer, sharing the day's events with the caller. The conversation was brief, and after hanging up, the protagonist approached the piano to close it. He felt a sense of satisfaction at the thought that his skills were still valuable to someone. Back at the ceremony, Gyubin was an important guest. Many attendees recognized the pianist, sharing stories of having seen him perform at various concerts around the world. The woman in whose honor the event was held had been his teacher and was delighted to catch up with her former student. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on everything and nothing at once. And when asked what he would be playing that evening, Gyubin chose to keep it a secret. Suddenly, Han Yun-sung appeared in their line of sight, and the woman quickly excused herself, saying she wanted to greet him. Gyubin had no choice but to watch their conversation from afar, his curiosity piqued by the man who had arrived at the ceremony. It so happened that the person Han Eun-seong had criticized for playing the piano while on the balcony was none other than Gyubin. Naturally, Gyubin had no idea and still doesn't know, but that didn't change the fact that the man had managed to capture his attention. On his way home after the lesson, Gyubin couldn't stop thinking about Han Yun-sung, recalling his expressions both during the ceremony and during their time together. These thoughts brought a satisfied smile to his lips and a flush to his cheeks. He seemed to be developing feelings for him. The first to greet Gyubin upon his return home was his younger brother, who came running towards him with joy. Scooping his brother into his arms, Gyubin made his way to the kitchen, where he greeted his mother and exchanged a few light-hearted words with her. Meanwhile, Han Yun-sung had a visit from Yehan, an old friend with whom he had recently spoken on the phone. The protagonist wasn't entirely sure why Yehan had come, but it turned out there wasn't much of a reason. The conversation drifted toward the topic of medications Yehan was taking to sleep, as well as alcohol. Han Eun-sung confessed that he had been considering quitting the medication as it made him feel worse afterward. Yehan supported his decision, and though it seemed the conversation could have ended there, he became curious about how the lesson had gone. Although they had discussed it briefly over the phone, it lacked detail, so now Han Eun-sung had to describe his student in depth. Eventually, Han Yun-sung stated that he wanted to sleep and was just about to head to bed. Yehan, openly concerned about his friend's well-being, urged him to get through the night without medication or alcohol, reminding him that the latter is harmful when consumed daily. Sitting beside him on the bed, Yehan said he would wait until he fell asleep. The protagonist didn't object and even thanked him for his concern. With his friend by his side, a sense of calm washed over him, and sleep overtook him almost immediately. Yehan gently stroked his arm, and before leaving, placed a soft kiss on his forehead, then quietly exited the room, leaving him to sleep peacefully. The next lesson was much more lively, but it seemed as if Gyubin was deliberately playing differently than instructed by his teacher. Han Eun-sung began to suspect this but decided to attribute it to a simple mistake, insisting that his students start over repeatedly. Suddenly, the man felt unwell and clutched his head. Gyubin noticed immediately, asking if everything was okay. The protagonist waved him off, saying he'd step away to get some water, while instructing Gyubin to continue playing. Gyubin didn't argue, but out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something odd when the teacher approached the refrigerator. His instincts were right. Han Eun-sung staggered and collapsed to the floor, prompting Gyubin to rush over and help. He assisted the man in getting up, wryly noting that it didn't seem like everything was fine. The awkward moment was interrupted by the ringing of a phone on the countertop, so the homeowner retreated to another room to take the call. Gyubin's curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to eavesdrop on the conversation. It turned out that Han Eun-seong's mother was on the line, asking why her son wasn't answering her calls and why he was ignoring the invitation to his sister's wedding. The man tried to convince her to speak with his sister directly, adding that he had already sent several email responses. However, his mother kept pressing, demanding to know why he wouldn't attend. The truth was obvious. She didn't actually want him there, which made Han Eun-sung feel almost ill. The conversation ended on a sour note, as it usually did, but there was nothing he could do about it. Regaining his composure, Han Eun-sung returned to the kitchen, where he found Gyubin cleaning up shards of a broken glass from the floor. Asking the young man to step aside, he took the cloth himself to clean up, when Gyubin suddenly mentioned the phone call. Gyubin admitted he had overheard the conversation, but the protagonist didn't scold him. Instead, he explained that such things often happen in the music world. Entire dynasties dedicate their lives to related professions, but in reality, things are rarely as perfect as they seem from the outside. Han Eun-sung suggested ending the lesson for the day as he still felt unwell, and Gyubin agreed. Before leaving, Gyubin turned back and asked again if the teacher was truly okay. Han Eun-sung assured him there was nothing to worry about, and Gyubin was about to exit the apartment when he heard a noise behind him. Han Eun-sung had collapsed unconscious right by the door, and Gyubin couldn't just leave him like that. All the protagonist could feel while unconscious were gentle touches on his face. They were so tender that he craved more, demanding the sensation to continue. But his surprise was immense when the awful condition passed, and he jolted awake in bed, startled. Turning his head, Han Eun-sung found Gyubin sitting beside him. Gyubin was on the floor, leaning against the bed, and it seemed he hadn't realized he had fallen asleep while watching over his teacher. When Han Eun-sung lost consciousness, Gyubin was genuinely at a loss. He had no choice but to lift the man and carry him to the bed, all the while debating whether to call an ambulance or emergency services. After laying the teacher down, he began to monitor his condition. Erratic breathing, flushed face. Touching Han Eun-sung's forehead, Gyubin realized he had a high fever and was about to fetch some water when he was abruptly stopped. Han Eun-sung grabbed his hand and, with half-closed eyes, silently pleaded for him to stay close. This behavior made Gyubin's cheeks flush with embarrassment, but he couldn't bring himself to refuse the request. Despite this, panic surged through him. He had no idea what to do next. Simply caressing his teacher's face didn't seem like a real solution. After making a small compress for his head, Gyubin received an unexpected call from Yahan, explaining that Han Eun-seong wasn't able to speak at the moment. Hearing another man's voice on the line, Han Eun-seong felt an inexplicable pang of jealousy and ended the call abruptly, unwilling to continue the conversation. Gyubin found this behavior odd, but it wasn't his place to pry, so he placed the phone beside the pillow. It was getting late, and Gyubin was about to leave when suddenly his shirt was tugged from behind. Unconsciously, Han Eun-sung asked him to stay, and Gyubin complied without hesitation. When he finally awoke, Han Eun-sung couldn't remember asking this and was mortified to find Gyubin by his bedside. Irrational thoughts about the previous night flooded his mind, making him feel even worse. Feeling movement under his hand, Gyubin soon woke up as well, sleepily lifting his gaze to meet Han Eun-sung's. Rubbing his eyes, he apologized for falling asleep and then asked what time it was. An awkward silence lingered in the room for a moment before Han Eun-seong broke it, mentioning a potential misunderstanding that could have occurred. Gyubin didn't quite grasp what he meant, so the man clarified. He was referring to the night they had just spent together. Gyubin let out an awkward laugh, then reassured his teacher that everything was fine. Nothing happened between them, and Han Eun-sung had simply been feverish. Han Eun-sung immediately felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly followed by a sudden headache. He asked for some water, and Gyubin was ready to fulfill the request, But as he touched Han Yun-seong, both froze. The protagonist sensed something tender in that touch, and giving in to his emotions, he nestled into Gyubin's hand, seeking more of that gentle contact. Everything happened so quickly and unexpectedly that Gyubin tensed up when he felt Han Yun-seong's touch on his own body. Han Yun-seong was insistent and clearly not in his right mind, but thankfully Gyubin managed to control the situation, repeatedly saying that they shouldn't go any further. Yet, when it came to the kiss, he couldn't resist and gave in to temptation. However, he quickly pulled away the moment he felt Han Yun-seong's hands in places they shouldn't be. Fortunately, things hadn't gone too far, and Gyubin was relieved. His teacher had simply passed out again, this time falling into a deep sleep. Stroking his hair, Gyubin decided to stay, remembering that he had been asked not to leave. Meanwhile, Han Yun-seong was dreaming. He was a child again, sitting at the piano with his mother beside him. She asked him if he enjoyed playing the piano, to which he joyfully responded with a yes. But then she suddenly asked him what he loved more, her or playing the piano. Han Yun-seong answered that he loved his mother more, and she seemed pleased with his response. However, in the next moment she disappeared, and the boy became noticeably frightened, calling out for her to come back. Gyubin woke up later, only to find the space beside him empty. After getting dressed, he went downstairs and noticed Han Yun-seong in the kitchen, engaged in conversation with someone. Deciding to eavesdrop, he paused on the staircase and soon realized that the guest was the man who had called the previous night. From their conversation, it became clear that Yehan was worried and also curious about who had spoken to him on the phone instead of Han Yun-seong. The protagonist pretended not to understand what Yehan was referring to, but his friend directly mentioned that he had called while Han Yun-seong was asleep. After a brief hesitation, Han Eun-seong explained that it was his student who had answered, which immediately led to accusations of him being reckless. A small argument ensued between the two men, which was abruptly interrupted by Gyubin slipping on the stairs. He tumbled all the way down, awkwardly raising his head in greeting. Han Eun-seong, realizing how absurd the situation had become, sighed deeply and nervously rubbed his eyes. Upon seeing the unfamiliar man, Yehan was outraged, immediately asking if he had spent the night at the apartment. Before Gyubin could say a word, Han Eun-seong intervened, explaining that this young man was his student and that he had slept in the guest room. Moreover, Yehan didn't need to ask silly questions. He could see the extra pair of shoes in the hallway for himself. Not wanting to escalate the conflict further, Yehan fell silent, casting a disappointed and angry glance at his friend. Gyubin tried to lighten the mood, but Han Eun-seong interrupted him again, stating that his blood pressure had dropped and he wasn't in the best of moods. After successfully ushering his student out the door, Han Yun-seong reassured him that they would be in touch later and that there was no need to worry right now. Exchanging a final look with Yehan, Gyubin reluctantly left the apartment, though he didn't really want to go. Before Yehan could say anything, Han Yun-seong started to explain, insisting that it wasn't what it might have looked like and that Gyubin truly was just a student learning to play the piano. Besides, he added, the guy was already married and he had even seen his son, who was in elementary school. Yehan was surprised by this information, but chose to believe him, although it all sounded quite dubious. As a doctor, Yehan cared deeply for his friend, and even the slightest deterioration in his condition caused him concern. Conveniently, the conversation turned to medications, and Yehan promised to write a new prescription. Before seeing Yehan off, Han Eun-seong asked him not to worry so much, as unnecessary stress would do no one any good. Left alone, the protagonist sighed with relief. Unlike the morning chaos, the apartment was now enveloped in complete silence. Suddenly, memories of the previous night began to resurface, particularly the moment when he kissed Gyubin. Han Eun-seong couldn't pinpoint what had triggered such behavior. Was it a side effect of the medication, or perhaps the weakness from not taking them? Either way, it didn't seem as important as the fact that, as he believed, Gyubin was married. Han Eun-seong began to seriously worry about how to explain to Gyubin that what had happened was a mistake. Meanwhile, Gyubin found himself stuck in traffic on his way home. His thoughts were preoccupied with the stranger who had called the previous night. He wondered how close the relationship between him and his teacher was, given that they called each other so late. Then, the memory of the spontaneous kiss flashed through his mind, causing Gyubin to blush instantly as he tried to push the thought away. Once home, he intended to relax, but his younger brother was clearly eager to play with him. Carefully examining Gyubin's face, the boy remarked that he looked a bit silly. He even mimicked the expression, causing Gyubin to laugh and playfully ruffle his brother's hair in response. It turned out that the boy recognized that expression. His desk mate at school had a crush on a girl, and every time he saw her, he had the same look on his face. So the younger brother concluded that Gyubin must like someone too. At first, Gyubin was taken aback, but then he jokingly pinched his brother's side, claiming that he was just making things up. Laughing, the boy ran off, while Gyubin stood there watching him, slowly realizing that maybe he did like someone, and that someone was his teacher. Gyubin didn't notice when he fell asleep, but his dreams were incredibly explicit, to the point where he woke up, blushing with embarrassment. Despite the unsettling dream, he had things planned for the day, and soon he was sitting in the studio. A friend entered the room and asked if everything was all right, but Gyubin brushed it off with a joke. Somehow, their conversation turned to the pianist Han Yun-sung, with the girl asking if Gyubin knew the name. Thankfully, the topic quickly died down, and they shifted focus to work-related matters. Suddenly, their discussion was interrupted by their supervisor, who entered the room clearly irritated and angry. She complained about how stressful a recent recording session had been. Taking a seat, she continued to grumble and casually mentioned that Han Yun-seong had the worst temperament in his entire family. She advised Gyubin not to get involved with him, noting that the man had a terrible reputation. Gyubin, not wanting to argue, simply nodded in agreement. Out of the blue, a colleague asked why Gyubin hadn't brought his younger brother with him. Knowing how much the boy enjoyed visiting the studio, Gyubin explained that his brother had piano lessons today, and when asked why he didn't teach his brother himself, he admitted that he didn't want to teach any relatives. Meanwhile, Han Yun-seong happened to run into the boy in the academy hallway. They exchanged awkward glances before the man took the initiative to greet him first. The boy politely returned the greeting, calling Han Yun-sung uncle, which left the man momentarily stunned. Deciding not to press the boy further, Han Yun-sung asked if the director was around, only to receive a negative response. The man didn't like that the director was avoiding him, but there was nothing he could do about it, so he simply sat down next to the boy to wait. An uncomfortable silence settled in the hallway, and Han Eun-sung couldn't help but notice how much the boy resembled Gyubin. Suddenly, the boy glanced up at him and made the most adorable face, asking for help tying his shoelaces. Although Han Yun-sung didn't really want to do it, he helped anyway, and then asked why no one had come to pick him up. It turned out that all of his family members were busy, so without much hesitation, Han Eun-sung offered to give the boy a ride. The boy didn't think twice and soon found himself sitting in the back seat of the car, excitedly gazing out the window. Han Yun-sung asked him to sit still, and while the boy obeyed, he couldn't hide his disappointment. The drive was quick, and as they arrived at their destination, the boy thanked Han Eun-seong for the ride and wished him a safe trip. By a stroke of luck, Gyubin happened to be passing by and spotted his brother standing on the curb. The car had already driven off, and, concerned as any older brother would be, Gyubin asked whose car it was. Grinning from ear to ear, the boy explained that it belonged to the uncle he had met at the academy. Not fully understanding who his brother was referring to, Gyubin decided to ask for clarification, though he had a hunch that it was Han Yun-sung. Once he was sure everything was fine, Gyubin listened to his brother's enthusiastic descriptions of how big and comfortable the car was while they rode the elevator up. It didn't quite match the stories he'd heard about Han Yun-sung being a meticulous genius and a rude perfectionist. Maybe those stories were true, but Gyubin didn't want to believe them, especially after how enjoyable it had been spending time with the man. His brother also mentioned how the uncle had tied his shoelaces, which reminded Gyubin of how Han Eun-seong had looked when he asked him to stay. The thought made Gyubin smile even more, realizing that sometimes rumors aren't always true. Lately, Han Eun-sung couldn't shake thoughts of his student from his mind. It had reached the point where he even considered that Gyubin was different from others, and if the young man weren't married, he wouldn't be so concerned about it. Despite this, their lessons continued, but with every minute spent together, Han Yun-seong felt increasingly embarrassed. He even contemplated ending the lessons, yet he had never seen a wedding ring on Gyubin's finger. Pushing those intrusive thoughts aside, Han Yun-seong decided to leave Gyubin alone, reminding himself that the young man came to lessons to learn piano, nothing more. But the thoughts kept coming one after another, and the main one was why Gyubin had never mentioned his wife or child. Unable to hold back, Han Yun-sung asked if Gyubin was seeing anyone. He immediately realized how absurd the question sounded, but Gyubin responded honestly and openly, no, he wasn't. Not sensing any hidden meaning in the question, Gubin was about to resume playing when he suddenly froze. He asked if his presence was a burden to his teacher. Naturally, Han Yunseong denied it, but Gubin didn't believe him. He abruptly stood up, glaring at the man with anger. Gubin asked if the teacher remembered what had happened that night, but instead of a clear response, he received only excuses. Their awkward conversation was interrupted by another phone call, and Han Yunseong was grateful for the distraction. He quickly retreated to another room to answer it. As it turned out, it was yet another call about the wedding, and once again, the protagonist declined to attend. His family was concerned about his decision and couldn't understand why he was taking things so personally. Gubin waited for his teacher to finish the call and then announced that he was leaving. He also mentioned that he wouldn't be able to attend the next lesson. Summer break had started at school, and he'd been invited to a sports festival. Han Yun-sung didn't mind, but he was surprised by what Gubin said next. Gubin asked him to call if he felt unwell. Just one call and he would come over. After his student finally left, Han Eun-sung began berating himself for always just nodding along to others' words and requests. However, there was one piece of information he had learned from today's lesson. Gubin wasn't married. The very thought of it made Han Eun-sung flush with embarrassment, while also deepening his self-reproach for the feelings that had begun to surface.